Hey guys, welcome back for part 2 of arrays. Last we were with each other, we just looked at how to create an array. We also looked at indexing and what indexing is, so how we can identify or access specific elements in our lists. Today we're going to look at how we can use that indexing to go a little further. So we're going to look at different ways that we can use this indexing. I'm going to pop into Eclipse so we can look at this stuff a little closer. First of all, I wanted to give you just, we're not here yet, but I just wanted to show you some different ways that this indexing could show up in our code. So here we have simply, we're multiplying some numbers out. So one thing to keep in mind is that anytime that we use indexing, so we're just going to assume there's an array called hours, and it probably holds some integers or something like that, right? So because we're calculating gross pay for somebody. And so there's just integers in it. Anytime we use indexing like this, we can use it any way that we normally would that data type. So if that array hours holds integers, I can use that format, hours3, any way I would normally use an integer. So here I can plug it straight into a formula, and it reads it like as if it were an integer. It just plugs in the integer value. So if the integer value at hours3 was a 12 gets plugged in. Okay, that's really important. And as we do, some more difficult stuff and algorithms, it gets a little harder to understand. But if you just remember that really basic idea that we can plug it in for anything. So here, cost could be a double, right? So we're looking at cost 4, whatever's there in that array, and we're comparing it to whatever is in at index 0 in the same array. So if cost 4 is less than cost 0, do something. We'll also look at how we can use loops with these, how we can control while loops with certain things in an array. So, we just have an array of values, and if it's not equal to 0, we keep going, right? And we'll look at different algorithms in the next portion and how we can go a little bit, how we're really going to be using these arrays in our programs. But today, I simply want to go a little bit further in how we can use indexing to control our arrays and access our arrays. And where we're going to start with is really the most basic loop that you're going to come across when it comes to arrays. And I literally call it our basic array for loop. So if we're given this array called ARR, and it has a couple of strings in it, right? We can either print out each thing one at a time, right? So we could do this, and we could do ARR 0, and then we could copy that, and we could paste it, and we can go ARR 1, and so forth, right? But what if and that's fine if you only have a couple of items in the array, but what if you don't know how big your array is? And that's the case most of the time. So most of the time, this is not the way that we're going to be doing this. If we want to print out everything in the array, if we just want to print out one thing, this is perfectly okay. But if we want to print out everything, or if we want to print out several things, a segment of that array, this is how we're going to be doing it. So our basic for loop is going to look like this. We're going to see this loop a lot. We have I starts at 0. And I less than ARR.length I plus plus. ARR.length, like we talked about previously, arrays are objects, and arrays have some methods that we can use. The first one we're going to look at is .length. .length returns the size or the length or the amount of elements that are inside that array. So essentially what this loop does, it starts at the first element 0, index 0. It goes all the way to the end of the array, and it goes up by one item each time. Okay. One thing to take note is the fact that this says less than and not less than or equal to. Let's talk about that. This array's length is a 2 because there's 2 items. So essentially what gets plugged in here is a 2. If we're looking at this, if I starts at 0, that's one iteration, and then it goes to 1, that's the second iteration, and then I increases to 2, and when it does increase to 2, the loop stops because there's no equals to. It's only when it's less than. Okay, so this loop will only loop 2 times. That's the only amount of times we need because there's 2 things in it. If I put an equals there, it will go 1 extra time, 3 times, and that's too much. What you're going to see is an array out of bounds or index out of bounds error. Okay, out of bounds meaning we went too far. We went too far for what the array has in it. So be really careful with using equals here. There will be some cases where maybe we do use that, but for the basic array for loop, it's simply less than and ARR.length. Do note that .length does not have a parentheses like methods normally do. Okay, so just do note that. And then the print statement simply grabs each element and then prints it out with a, I really didn't need that space, did I? Because I printed them on different lines. And then just prints out each element as it goes through. So hello world. Okay, let's look at the enhanced for loop. This is one we'll use sparingly. There'll be some times where I say, hey, I want you to try an enhanced for loop with this. This is not one we'll use all the time because it has its own, there has to be some conditions met for us to use it. And the way it works is that, and I'll read through this in a second, we have an array 2, 3, 4, and then it says for int val, and then we've got a colon and nums. Let me break down what this is really saying. Over here on this side, we give it the array or the list. Okay, the enhanced for loop is specifically used with arrays. So it knows I'm going to look over here for a list. I have to give it one. On the left-hand side, this is a temporary variable. It has to match the data type that's inside of the array that's over here. Okay, so if I were to make this ARR, that's not going to match. ARR has strings, and this is an integer. If I change this to a string, it's happy again. Okay, so it has to match the data type of the array that you're looping through. It's going to loop through this array, nums. Val is going to temporarily grab every value in the array. So as it goes through the array, the first time that it loops, val is going to equal a 2. The next iteration, val is going to equal, whoops, good lord, val equals 2. The next time through, val is going to equal a 4, a 3. And then the last time through, it will equal a 4. Okay, so as I print, it's simply going to print out each value. This is really handy if you want to go through the whole thing and just do something with everything in there. If everything's going to get treated the exact same way, this is a great way to do that, and it's really simple. It's a lot less complicated. The syntax is a little hard to remember sometimes because we're not going to use it all the time. But here's some limitations. The limitations are that it does not have a counter. This doesn't use I. So if there's ever a case where we need to use I for something, remember when we use I a lot of times as a counter, like we'll use it in our algorithm or in our code. So if we ever do need to use it, this is not appropriate. Also, enhanced for loops will always go through the entire array. It will not do a part of an array or one element. It will always go from the start to the finish. So if we ever need to just do a piece of it, this is not the appropriate loop to use. So keep this. We'll refer back to it. There'll be some times I go, hey, use an enhanced for loop, and we'll practice it, and we'll refer back to the syntax. So okay, let's go a little bit further. What if we want to use an array with a method? This seems kind of simple, but seeing it for the first time is a little odd. It's a little weird. So here's how that would look at using an array with a method. We've got an array up here called nums, 2, 3, 4. Here we've got our basic array for loop, okay? It's going to go through the entire array, one item at a time, and here's what it's going to do. It's going to call this method, square, and let's look at square. Square is going to take in an integer and return an integer. Okay, cool. What's it going to do with it? It's going to take that number and it's going to square it. So mat.pow raises it to the second power and then returns it. Cool. So if I look back up here, num's I. Num's I is going to reference an integer inside this array. So 2. It's going to send that 2 to the method. It takes that 2, it squares it, and it sends it back. So when it squares 2, it's going to send back a 4, right? So what's going to happen to that 4 when it sends it back? It's going to set num's I to 4. So essentially, it's going to replace everything in here with its square. So what I end up getting when I print is 4, 9, and 16. Okay, now let's look at how I printed this. Here I have a method called print array. It's a void array, a void method, so it doesn't return anything. It accepts an array. Here's what that would look like, just like everything else. On the left-hand side here, I give it the data type, and then I give it a variable name. Same thing. That's the data type. It's an integer array. And then I give it a name for the variable, right? Typically, we just use ARR because we want to keep it generic, because we want to use this method with any array, right? So we just keep it generic. ARR is really generic, a generic name. Here's our basic for loop, array for loop, and we're just printing out each element. Here's what's cool about this method. Now that I have it, I can print out any array that I want to print out using this. So it has now become an algorithm. It's something I can call every single time I want to print the elements from an array. So here, instead of having to type this for loop over and over again, I can simply call this method and print out the array. So I can do this, right? Let's do it like this instead. Let's add a comma in here, separated by a comma. Let's do this. I didn't like that. Let's just go this out. That'll work. So now, we'll worry about that later. But you can see I print out the array first, right? 2, 3, 4. And then I print it out again, 4, 9, 16. And I've essentially saved myself a few lines of code by simply calling that array or calling that method instead of having to do this entire thing over and over again. So, but this is the main thing I wanted you to see, is that that's how it would look if I wanted to send an array to a method. We can also return arrays back from a method. So keep that in mind. That's a possibility. We could look at that later.